All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jim Rice. I'm from the MIT Center for Transportation Logistics, and I'm happy to start today's webinar hosted by our center here. This webinar is part of our series entitled Advances in Supply Chain Management webinar series, and today's topic is Delivering Green, 3 case studies in carbon-efficient logistics. Our host today is Dr. Edgar Blanco, who is the Research Director of the Carbon Efficient Supply Chain Research Group, the Leaders in Environmental Assessment Performance, or LEAP, research initiative, and he's also the Executive Director of the SCALE Network in Latin America. Dr. Blanco will be joined by Jason Mathers of EDF, Ross Corthell of Boise, Christine Young of Ocean Spray, and Zena Onstadt of Caterpillar. In just a moment, I'll turn it over to Dr. Blanco, but I'd like to invite each of you to send any questions that you have for the panelists using the Q&A feature that's available in a drop-down menu at the very top of your screen. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Blanco.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon or morning to everyone that is joining us. Again, I'm Edgar Blanco from the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. And as Jim was mentioning earlier, we are thrilled to have today's webinar share with you some of the findings of our series of case studies on carbon-efficient logistics. Let me kind of give you a little bit of an extended introduction to all the members of the webinar today that are going to be presenting and sharing some of the learnings through these case studies. First, we have Jason Mathers from Environmental Defense Fund. He is the Senior Manager and leads the Corporate Freight Sustainability Initiatives in EDF. He's one of the leading authorities on logistics and sustainability, and he works with the largest shippers to identify and implement strategies that increase carbon efficiency in freight transportation in general. As a side note, EDF was the sponsoring organization that made these case studies possible. So thank you again to EDF for their support. Next, we're going to be hearing from Ross Corthell. He's the General Manager of BCT, a for-hire common carrier tracking company, wholly owned subsidiary of Boise, where he has worked for over at least 16 years. Ross has extensive experience in transportation and logistics, leading big projects within Boise that include many of its customers. We also have today Zena Onstadt from Caterpillar. Zena has over 20 years of experience in improving operations in the automotive industry, and her current focus is supply chain inbound logistics and packaging as a Caterpillar Production Systems Black Belt. And also joining us, we're going to have Christine Young, Sustainability Manager from Ocean Spray's Cranberries. And Christine is the Manager of Sustainability for Ocean Spray and has been working on moving Ocean Spray's vision of a sustainable operation and products over the last several years. And all of them are the people that I have had the pleasure to work with for the last almost a year as we went through each of these case studies. So let's get started without further ado. And I would like first to start with Jason. Jason Mathers from EDF as one of the sponsoring organizations. And I actually want to ask Jason to talk a little bit about why did EDF thought about this project, and what is the interest and vision of carbon efficient logistics?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Edgar, for asking me to participate in this webcast and for your work and that of your colleagues at CTL in producing these strong case studies that demonstrate the connection between cutting costs and carbon emissions through better logistics. And Ross and Zena and Christine, thank you, too, for collaborating with EDF to tell the stories of how your companies are doing well by doing good. I want to start first for those on the line that are not familiar with Environmental Defense Fund. We are an independent nonprofit organization. Our overall mission at EDF is to preserve the natural systems on which all life depends. We work to solve the most critical challenges facing the planet. And one of the ways we work is by partnering with some of the largest nations, with some of our nation's largest and most iconic companies to identify and demonstrate best practices that create business value and improve environmental performance. Supply chain logistics is a ripe area for these types of best practices. Freight's a major cost center for companies. Shippers who are the consumers of freight moves spend nearly $800 billion a year to transport products, and freight is also a major source of corporate global warming pollution, accounting for about 15% of the total footprint in the U.S. In the logistics space, EDF works in a few distinct ways. First, we partner with corporations to help set and achieve sustainable measures for sustainability in their logistics operations. And second, we gather information about what works. We collect and share knowledge about the most effective practices in reducing costs and carbon emissions through the supply chain. And this case study series is the best example yet that demonstrates the fundamental connection between the cost and carbon emissions for freight. Next slide, please, Edgar. So freight is a significant source of global warming emissions, both at the global level and here at the U.S. Globally, freight accounts for about 6% of total global warming emissions. In the U.S., freight emissions account for nearly 10% of total emissions. And that, in the U.S., that equates to 500 million metric tons each year. To give you a sense of what that means, it's the same as 150 coal-fired power plants or burning of 1 billion barrels of oil, which is more than the annual output of Iraq. So when Edgar asked the question of why does EDF care about identifying strategies to reduce the carbon impacts of freight, it's because it's significant and there's a lot of opportunity to bring those emissions down while also increasing business value. And of course, probably the most important reason of all this is that freight emissions are projected to grow significantly over the coming years. Actually, Edgar, if you go back to the previous slide, which depicts ExxonMobil's view on how energy demand from transportation is expected to grow. These are global projections, and as you all on the line can see, demand for oil to power light-duty vehicles is leveling out. Commercial transportation, which is largely engaged in moving freight, however, is continuing to increase rapidly. In the U.S., the picture is even more stark. By 2040, emissions from freight are projected to increase by more than 40% from today's levels. And this is over the same period when the best science tells us we must be significantly reducing our emissions from today's levels. EDF believes we can continue to grow our economy and our freight industry while also significantly reducing global warming pollution. Doing this will require more efficient trucks, trains, and ships. We also need to get more out of them and create a logistics system that is more efficient itself. Shippers, the consumers of freight moves, have a leading role in making this system more efficient, and that's one of the things we're trying to demonstrate through this case study. Next slide, please. Shippers have the power to cut U.S. freight emissions by up to 200 million metric tons from today's level. The actions they need to take to accomplish these results will reduce transportation costs significantly too. EDF summarized the type of actions that will lead to these impressive results into 5 rules for cleaner freight, and we're already seeing leading companies leveraging these rules today to improve their operational efficiencies. The first rule is to improve the hotspots your cargo moves through. People who live near ports, rail depots, and congested stretches of the highway are disproportionately harmed by the air pollution that is caused by the freight system. These pollutants, which come from older diesel trucks, trains, ships, and cargo handling equipment, are very harmful to human health, and they are most harmful in continuing exposure over a long time. Shippers need to work with their transportation providers to make sure that their goods are being moved on equipment that meets today's strictest emission control levels. And where this is not happening, shippers have a responsibility to work with their partners to help them develop an aggressive emission reductions plan. The second rule is choose the most efficient mode possible. Frankly, mode matters in regards to cost and carbon emissions. Choosing to send freight on a plane instead of a ship results in 47 times more carbon pollution, and carbon is 6 times more carbon polluting than using rail. Our third rule is to collaborate with other shippers, and when it comes to sustainability strategies, EDF believes that collaborative distribution is the total package. Improved business value propositions, sizable cost reductions, and the promise of significant emission reductions. Under a collaborative distribution arrangement, companies in the same or similar industries can share warehouse and distribution assets. Because these products from the participating companies are going to the same destination, the arrangement enables more efficient loading of trucks, more frequent deliveries, and fewer truck miles, which lowers emissions. When a full-fledged collaborative distribution arrangement doesn't make sense, companies can still look for opportunities to match backhauls or to co-load freight on trucks. The next rule is to get the most out of each move. No matter what mode you use, you can save money and emissions by maximizing the cargo capacity on every single truck or shipping container. And lastly, we're encouraging shippers to redesign their networks for efficiency. The design of a distribution network, of course, reflects many factors, and all in this distribution network strive to deliver goods accurately, on time, while minimizing cost. And as companies look at ways to reduce fuel expend through their distribution network and redesign their networks to reduce miles coming out of those distribution networks, they're also going to be reducing the carbon footprint of servicing that area. I think in sum, we see that shippers are in the center of the freight universe, and that their decisions send strong market signals and set actions and motions. EDF believes that by adopting these 5 rules, shippers can set us on a course for a future with a more efficient freight transportation system that has significantly lower levels of pollution. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. I think that this set up the stage nicely to go deeper into all the case studies. I think that these rules are things we can all relate to, and what we were trying to do with each of these companies was to illustrate how they have been able to achieve cost reductions at the same time that they have reduced carbon. So let me get started, and let me invite Ross to join us and talk a little bit about the experience and the project of leveraging Rail Direct service in Boise. Ross?
Yes, thank you so much, Edgar, and my appreciation to both you and Jim and the group at MIT, as well as Jason and the Environmental Defense Fund for working with us collaboratively on this case study, as well as the webinar and hosting this. So thank you, folks. And thanks to all the folks that have dialed in to listen to this as well. This is a great topic. We're thrilled to be a part of it, and so we appreciate everybody's time in dialing in to take this in. A little bit about Boise. We're a packaging and paper company headquartered in Boise, Idaho. We have about $2.5 billion in sales annually. We have a couple of packaging subsidiaries, one called Hexacomb in Buffalo Grove, Illinois, and another, Tharco Incorporated, out in San Lorenzo, California. That's in addition to our own legacy packaging plants. And then we have paper mills in Jackson, Alabama, International Falls, Minnesota, and Wallula, Washington, as well as a couple of paper distribution centers. Really, the project that we worked on, there's a couple of projects highlighted here, and there's many that we work on a continuum, but we're real proud of a couple that are highlighted here in the case study. And if I look at the 5 rules for cleaner freight that Jason highlighted, we really hit on all of those cylinders. So we're real proud to present this. The first one is about carload direct. In Jason's point number 3, where he said collaborate with other shippers, I would add to that to collaborate with your customers as well. And in this particular project, we did just that. We collaborated with our single largest customer, who is OfficeMax, and they represent about 40% of our white paper sales. We sell cut-size communications papers through their network. And because of that density, and I would call that one of the hot spots, is going to their distribution centers that have enough density to consider utilizing a more efficient mode of transportation, i.e. rail. And we have paper mills that are all rail served, and we discovered, of course, that OfficeMax had several distribution centers that were also rail served. And prior to that, we were hitting their their distribution centers with truckload shipments. So we worked collaboratively with OfficeMax to establish processes where we could actually replenish their inventory with Rail Direct. And in 2012, that led us to do about 256 direct rail shipments with OfficeMax. And in the calculations that MIT as well as EDF have provided, that was a 70% reduction in CO2 emissions. Again, that was a collaborative approach with OfficeMax. Those aren't easy hurdles because rail requires longer lead times, has much more variability in transit. In one lane in particular, we had 3 days average transit in truckload, and with rail, our mean transit was 9 days with a standard deviation of 1.8. So you can see the challenges associated with asking your customer to work with you to manage through the variability in the lead times as well as the order sizes of an initiative like this. I'm going to move on to the 3-tier pallet. This is an asset utilization play, and the picture is a very good illustration. If you look at the center, this is a picture inside of a boxcar, by the way. And if you look at the picture, you can see the bottom tier of pallets. There's 3 cartons, or 3 tiers of cartons, I should say, stacked on each of those pallets. And then the 2 pallets above that, there are 5 tiers of cartons stacked on those. Our traditional SKU for palletized product was 5 cartons of product, and we could ship 2 sets of 5-tier pallets each stacked inside of a boxcar prior to this initiative. But you could see that we had a fair amount of space that was left empty inside the rail car at that time. So a group of people got together to see if we could modify our SKU and developed a 3-tier pallet which allowed us to stack more product inside the same asset. And this required quite a lot of collaboration up and down the supply chain just to create a different SKU that customers would be willing to accept 3-tier pallets from us. And it was the result of a lot of hard work, but we're very proud of the fact that this asset utilization play increased our utilization of those boxcars by over 8%. 17% of our shipments in 2012 were 3-tier, or at least contained some 3-tier pallets inside of them. And the CO2 savings over the long term was about a 6.8% reduction in CO2 emissions. So again, a very collaborative, very common sense approach that not only was economically better for Boise, but also better for the planet and hitting on all the cylinders that Jason described. I would call the hot spots those where we have density. The most carbon efficient mode is for us, that's a choice between rail and truck. Rail is certainly the more carbon efficient mode. Collaboration with customers to get that done and getting the most out of each move. So this 3-tier certainly gets the most out of those rail cars, as you can see. And then the last one is redesigning our own network for efficiency. It's not necessarily highlighted in this presentation, but we do that consistently. And one of the things that we do is we have a software optimization program, or a network optimization program, I should say, that takes into consideration carbon emissions. So we're getting the most out of our network as well. With that, I pass it back to you, Edgar, and appreciate everybody's time and attention on this webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Ross, for sharing Boise's initiatives and journey. Again, reminder to everyone, we'll field all your questions at the end of the session, so just type them in the Q&A box. And I just want to go back to one of the bullets that Ross mentioned about the estimation of CO2. I'll talk more about that at the end, towards the end of the webinar, why sometimes in this case it was slightly more difficult to estimate those savings from this fabulous initiative of 3-tier pilots. Let me now invite Sina Onstott from Caterpillar to talk about the two initiatives that were featured in the Caterpillar case study. And with that, Sina, the floor is yours.
Hi there. Thank you. Good day to everyone. I also want to share our appreciation to the teams for working together with us and helping us in our sustainability journey, and looking forward to continued projects in the future. Caterpillar, we're the world's largest manufacturer of construction and mining equipment, diesel and natural gas engines, industrial gas turbines, and diesel electric locomotives. So obviously with this large group of products to choose from, we had to hone it down and look for a project that was a little bit more manageable for, to look at the scope of everything. So we chose the Global Mining Division, and we selected three models of the large mining truck group to work with. These were all out of the Decatur, Illinois facility. And we focused on North America. We used all the parts there were thousands of parts from all over the U.S. that were within these three models that we used for our study. So two of the things that we looked at were the lightweighting of the containers and the transportation modes that we were using. In the example on the left, it shows this is a very typical way that we ship the product into our facilities. This is a steel container, a steel tub. We have 3 different sizes of these, but obviously with the weight on that, when you're shipping those back empty, you could fill up a trailer with the packaging before you're even shipping your components in those. And we've opted to go with a lot more of the lighter weight plastic containers, which it really drove a lot of savings in the CO2 reduction and fuel savings just by going to those lightweighted containers before you do anything about consolidating the shipments or moving your packages together. By doing some of those changes, it drove some different projects or some different items that we were doing in receiving and transportation because of the way that we had to handle those products. So it was kind of challenging, but it really was a great project, and we've piloted one at the facility in Decatur already. So we've already started implementing the changes that we learned from the study. This picture represents the opportunities that we have within from bundling with the transportation. So we took the Decatur, Illinois facility, and the red dots represent the different suppliers across the country that are shipping into us. So if you can see the square over to the right, it's like all of those are clusters of suppliers that we are looking at possibly bundling the transportation moves. If we can pull those together, can we change the week of the shipment or the day of the week of the shipment? How can we change the packaging, and what is the cost effectiveness of changing those transportation lanes? Then this last slide, this one's representing the red line is showing that as you start to consolidate your shipments and you kind of reach that sweet spot on your cost reductions and your opportunities. So in this slide, it's really showing you that it was about 15% of the outer route is where our sweet spot was for looking at the Decatur data for those 3 units, that this is where it was going to reach the benefit to show the most carbon effectiveness and the cost reductions. Edgar, you might want to speak a little bit more to that. I'm not sure if I captured everything.
Thank you, Sina. No, actually, you did a great job. And I think that sometimes one of the things that this case study, especially the inbound consolidation aspect of it, as Sina was explaining in this chart, is that sometimes there's an optimal solution for carbon and one that is optimal for cost. In this case, from a perspective of carbon, the more shipments you consolidate, the better off you are. However, the complexity of the operation increases, the number of shipments you have to coordinate increase, and the cost reductions start to flatten. So if you look at the dotted line, so at some point there's this where you can really maybe consolidate more shipments, but the cost reduction opportunities diminish and flatten. However, carbon could be increased, but at that point, the operational effectiveness of this initiative is no longer sustained. So this kind of sensitivity analysis that we were able to perform with the collaboration of Caterpillar is the kind of analysis that could be done when you have a little more complex decisions like how much of this consolidation could happen. But I think that's all I would like to add on that, Tina. I think that wraps up for Caterpillar, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tina. So now let me invite our third case study. And for that, Christine Young is going to talk about some of the network redesign and how Ocean Spray leveraged that change. So Christine, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Again, this is Christine Young, and I lead our sustainability efforts here at Ocean Spray. Hopefully most of you have heard of Ocean Spray, but you may not realize that we are a vertically integrated cooperative, farmer cooperative owned by over 700 cranberry growers and 35 grapefruit growers. We're the North America's leading producer of juice drinks and sweetened dried cranberries, and we have an annual revenue of $2.2 billion. And so when we look at sustainability, one thing I wanted to do is try to put this case study and this project into perspective, because we're actually executing sustainability from bog to cup in 5 core pillars around agriculture, water and stewardship, climate and energy, packaging, and then also landfill waste reduction. So when we look at climate and energy, we actually, I've listed here what our 2 goals are on the climate and energy side, and it's in our direct operations. So in sustainability speak, that means that we're looking and focusing on our scope 1 and 2 emissions, but in 2009 we conducted a full greenhouse gas inventory, or a scope 3 inventory, and there we noted that over 17% of our emissions resulted from the movement of goods or transportation, and you can see that on the bottom. So while we're as a grower cooperative, we're steadily working and focusing on the farm level, we also noted that transportation is the largest single source emission segment within our value chain. So we decided to go ahead and start looking at that more directly. And when we think about carbon emissions and reductions in transportation, we also found that there's a good business case for that because it directly equates to cost savings. So it's a truly sustainable solution, both for the environment and also for the business. So if we'll go to the next slide, working with MIT and EDF, it was great for us to kind of deconstruct 2 major network redesign and then also a shift to rail, 2 transportation projects that we've taken on in the recent years for us to really illustrate this connection between carbon and cost savings. Again, I'll say that, quite honestly and frankly, that we looked at these logistic changes and implemented from a business reason, therefore for cost savings, but we, through this partnership and working on this study, have really been able to see how tracking carbon will lead us to finding more efficiency and cost savings within our network. So the first scenario that we looked at was really an interesting opportunity that our transportation team worked on very diligently to look how we could shift to rail one of our key lanes going from New Jersey to Florida. And in order to do that, we collaborated with a couple of other companies, both a third-party logistics company, the railroad, and then another fruit company, another competitor, to utilize empty rail cars that were returning to Florida empty. For us, that resulted in us being able to shift about 80% of our freight traffic between New Jersey and Florida to the new rail route. And that resulted in a 40% transportation cost savings. So I'll reiterate that the cost savings we shared here is just focused on what it costs from a transportation standpoint. And then we also saw that, and through the study, we're able to calculate that we reduced our CO2 emissions by 65% per load. So on a given year, based on the current volume traveling on that route, it's equivalent of saving 100,000 gallons of fuel annually, so it's pretty significant. This is also a strategic project for us overall because we expect production in this region to continue to increase, and we'll be able to utilize the rail line more now that we've kind of worked out the logistics of it and we've got that operating and working very well. And then the second scenario that we were able to look at was really just a realignment of supply and demand, which I think is a very standard thing that companies look at, where we're moving production of our products closer to consumer demand, and we did that into the Southeast Florida region. And what we basically did is we set up new manufacturing and distribution capability in Florida, and overall that resulted in a 15% cost savings, and then also a reduction of 18% in CO2 savings. Now, while the magnitude of the percentage is less for this scenario, the absolute impact is very high, where I believe the total tons of CO2 we're saving per year is over 10,000. So those are the two scenarios that we looked at, and what I really liked about this study and working with Edgar and then also Jason is we really took two very traditional logistics scenarios that our business team looks at on a regular basis. We have a great team working here at Ocean Spray that's very dedicated at looking at efficiency. They work really hard, always trying to find that. We basically deconstructed them. So they had built them up, and then we went back and kind of deconstructed to follow the carbon savings. And so what we were able to do by doing that, kind of following the path of a traditional decision making, was I like to think that we're taking this learning and now being able to take it back to action. The one thing that our supply chain team has done already is they've started to integrate this carbon calculation into our internal reporting. And what that means for us is that on a monthly basis, our supply chain team produces a scorecard with traditional business metrics. And we're now integrating that into tracking and reporting carbon emissions into that same scorecard. And, you know, when going through this process, you know, part of it is trying to first map that out and understand where do you get the data from and how are you going to calculate it. And I think sometimes calculating the carbon emissions can be daunting, and luckily Edgar and Jason were there to help us with that. They were a huge support on helping develop a tool, a calculator that we could have on hand. But we also found that sometimes it's just as simple as just asking. One of our vendors that we work very closely with, TMC, they were actually already tracking and calculating emissions for over 80% of our outbound shipments. So purely by asking the right questions, we were able to gather that data and start putting it into our monthly tracking. And then I think the other thing that we've taken away from this is that shifting to rail is a real opportunity. It's a reduction in truck transportation and therefore CO2 emissions. But as was shared earlier, you know, rail is much cheaper for us than over the road. So one thing that we started to do is we're tracking our top 10 intermodal lanes and comparing average pounds of CO2 emissions per load for intermodal versus over the road. So it's another way that we're able to just track efficiency and see how we're doing on those top 10 intermodal lanes. So with that, I think that those are the two key things that we've taken away from this, and I've been very excited and very happy to work with Jason and Edgar with their expertise, and then working on how do we integrate this into our supply chain function on a daily basis.
All right. Thank you very much, Christine. And let me kind of, again, thank this company. They were very patient with us as we went back and forth with all these questions we had as we were doing these case studies. Let me kind of recap. And we heard directly from each of them what a specific initiative was highlighted and the results that we were able to quantify. But since people that know me, they know that every time I have a presentation, I have to have at least one formula. I guess it's part of the MIT requirements. So I wanna share with you. You can get the details on each of the case studies as they get released. But this is a one-slide summary of what I call the carbon efficiency math. Basically, as you've seen, these initiatives were not only carbon efficient in terms of reducing carbon, but they were also reducing cost. And this is just a simplified version of lots of the calculations that we were doing throughout the three case studies. So on the top is how do we usually compute cost in logistics and transportation. So you have D, some sort of distance that the shipment is traveling, some sort of weight that that shipment costs, and that eventually translates into a rate for moving that good between those 2 points. And that's, in a simplified version, how the cost of moving goods work in these global logistics networks. If we look at below that one, we have the formula for CO2, and you'll see that there's also distance there. There's also weight, but then instead of rate, we have an emission factor. This is what has changed over the last 3-4 years since we have been working actively in some of these calculations. When these initial goals of reducing CO2 were out there, the information was a little shifting, still shifts about how to get these emission factors. But today, and as you can also find in the case study directly, there are repositories of data that are fairly robust and that can be used to analyze these kind of initiatives like the one that were shared today by our 3 partner organizations. And the interesting thing is that when the rates usually go down, the emission factors go down. So that was the examples that we heard from both Christine and Ross about rail or intermodal compared to truck. So if you look at the cost per mile or cost per ton mile of those modes, those tend to be cheaper, but at the same time they will emit less CO2 per ton mile. So when you can find those opportunities, caveats of service management with your customers and suppliers to make sure that you are on time, then you're able to reduce CO2. But you also notice that every time you find ways to change the distance, in this case, the distance, we have 2 examples of those. We heard from the Network Redesign project at Ocean Spray, where you can realign your network, and that will change the actual distance that is flown, where products are moved in your network. Or if you consolidate inbound shipments, like what happened in the Caterpillar case study, you will also be able to affect this without changing your mode. And then you have the third aspect, that is the weight. In the case of Caterpillar, when Sina was describing this packaging redesign, lightweighting of the containers, what effectively by moving from steel totes to lightweight options, you were effectively reducing the weight of every shipment, which will also translate into less CO2 and up to a certain point also reduction in costs. The case of high utilization of the rail cars that Ross shared is a little bit more, it's harder to estimate the CO2 reductions, but it's possible. And I will encourage you to take a look at that particular project and case study once it's released so you can see how this is done. But once you pack more a particular lane with products, so the net weight may not necessarily decrease, but over the long run, you will reduce the number of shipments, and that's how you can compute the CO2 savings. So that's a little bit a summary of the carbon efficient math that went behind each of these initiatives. At the end, anything that reduces distance or uses the distance more efficient, maximizes the amount of weight in a single shipment, or reduces the weight by smart packaging, or mode shift will simultaneously reduce cost as well as CO2. So I think that as a wrap up before we go into some of the Q&As, I think that it's always scary to start doing the math the first time. The formulas and the computations are not as complicated as one initially may think, but actually the assumptions matter. And that's what we always advocate for data transparency. You have to make some choices. Some data is going to be accurate. Some data is not going to be as accurate. Some emission factors are going to be very precise. Others are going to change more over time. But the math works mainly because you should always disclose your assumptions. And I think we try to illustrate what kind of assumptions you may need to make and how they could impact your CO2 reductions. So that's on the mathematical side. And I think that the rules that Jason kicked us off in the webinar actually matter a lot. So the math works, but ultimately this needs to fit with the operational focus of the company. And I like this line of making every move count. And making every move count includes a variety of initiatives. I think Ross highlighted this includes collaboration with customers to try to make every move count even more, or by exploring new ways of moving product to customers. I think Ocean Spray discussed how they collaborated with one of their competitors and had to think creatively with their third-party logistics providers how to make an intermodal shipment. This was more within their network and not to customers. And they also need to make that move count. As you go through these initiatives, this operational focus is going to be paramount, especially because you're going to have to manage more modes, maybe lanes where you did not used to have rail or barge or different kinds of pallets and containers. You will need to manage. This variety of your network requires commitment of your group, and that's what we always advocate to make sure that there is not only a CO2 reduction initiative, but also some cost motivations, because they'll need some fine-tuning to go in the network. Internal collaboration and external collaboration, I should highlight here, were always central within all of these case studies. Internal collaboration in making sure the initiatives were rolled out, and external collaboration in finding new partners that you may need to go through. And finally, and this is what we believe will make this sustainable in any organization, is to make sure you tie this to metrics and scorecards. The fact that in logistics and transportation, this alignment of math happens makes the ability to move these metrics and scorecards into your normal operation a more feasible proposition. This matters. I think that this makes give the opportunity of us to be in the forefront of rolling initiatives in our organizations. So I think those were kind of my closing comments here, and we will now go to the Q&A session. And I will ask now Jim to go through some of the Q&A questions that we have received from participants. As a reminder, there's a Q&A box where you can type in your questions, and we will do our best to answer them. And with this, Jim,
okay, thank you, Edgar, and thanks to each of the other presenters. First question that I'd like to put out to the group is as follows. What are your plans in each of your organizations to embed carbon calculations in future logistics projects?
So let me get started a little bit with maybe Ross. Ross, maybe you want to start?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you that's a great question, Jim. I mentioned the network optimization software that we're committed to purchasing, and you know, clearly one of the components of that package is to ensure that there is a carbon calculator, and that there's some, you know, what I like to call sanity behind the math that the calculator is using. So that's one of the things that we're doing, and I think Kristen made a great point, and that is, you know, ask those questions of your suppliers. We also happen to be a customer of C.H. Robinson's TMS model called TMC, and they indeed have a great calculator just for your day-to-day shipment information. And so sometimes it is just the obvious is right in front of you. Ask the question, and you should be able to deliver results on that.
Good. I'm not sure if maybe Sina, you want to add something up to what Ross said?
No, just that our the CPS, the Caterpillar Production System, this is something that we're definitely looking at embedding in our core processes and guiding principles to be able to, you know, add these the logistics or the I can't speak today, that we add the information in and build that logic into the information so that everybody in the supply chain understands that.
Thank you, Cindy. I think you mentioned already, Christine, that this is already being rolled out, but maybe you can share more details about how the group has been accepting some of these new metrics into their normal day-to-day operation.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to, and I would even go further than saying they're accepting it. I've been extremely impressed with our supply chain and logistics team here at Ocean Spray. They're not only accepting it, they really take an ownership of it. They have a little team that meets on a regular basis, trying to flesh out how to integrate this. I believe they've dubbed themselves the Carbon Cool Calculating Tool Team or something. I'm probably getting it wrong, but they even have their own little name for themselves. So they're really taking ownership and running away with it. And I think the other thing that I would emphasize is one thing I really like about working so closely with the supply chain business team is they've been able to really identify where this metric needs to live and where it needs to be housed, how it's going to be meaningful for them. And so now it's in a place and on a scorecard that everyone sees on a monthly routine basis. And part of this is socializing not only the idea but the terminology and the actual calculation itself. So that now that as we're looking at transportation and logistics, carbon CO2 emissions are on there, and that in itself spurs a conversation on what exactly does that mean, why is that here, where else should we be using it. So it's definitely very impactful and very innovative, and a great leadership that this team has taken on.
Thank you. Maybe Jason, I know you work with several organizations from EDF. Is there something else you would like to add from your experience?
Yeah, sure, Edgar. I think that just second your comment about the importance of metrics and having this data, and I think that one of the things that we think is really critically important, and a way to help transportation practitioners be successful in implementing sustainability is to have objective metrics that help guide their decision making and help demonstrate for their executives the success that they're having and why this is important. And so the carbon metrics and the cost metrics are both critically important to that.
Thank you. Jim?
We have another question, and it reads as follows. Tell us more about the sources of data for CO2 emissions. Are they reliable?
I guess that's for me. Let me talk a little bit about some of these sources of emission factors that were used when we do some of these calculations. So these emission factors are usually released by mode of transportation. So depending on the mode of transportation that you want to try to estimate the CO2, you will go to different sources. The EPA SmartWay program, for example, has been compiling for several years now data from mainly truckload carriers of different types across the U.S., mainly large carriers, and those are publicly available. So you could go in, and if one of your carriers is a SmartWay certified carrier, they can also give you their detail under a specific CO2 emission factor. One thing to keep in mind is that these are average CO2 emission factors that are not for a specific lane, but are for a group of lanes usually and services provided by these carriers. So with that in mind, you need to always be mindful that like the case of all the case studies we were addressing, the decision was throughout the network, or at least was not specific for making carrier decisions, so those emission factors were adequate. The same when we talk about ocean, although the case studies were mostly focused on U.S., there's the Clean Cargo Working Group, and they are releasing data on ocean transportation emission factors. Again, always check the assumptions, but they are out there and publicly available as well. We have for rail, most of the rail providers, they actually have been releasing this information in public. So in our case studies, we were actually able to compare the rail-specific factor versus the average rail factor, and they were very accurate. And I encourage you to tap into their own calculators, and they will be happy to provide it. And for air is where things are a little bit more complicated. I think that on the air transport, there's data that has been provided, but this data is less standardized, and maybe now is only in the house by these providers themselves. In any case, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, if you do not have access to any of these data sources and you're just trying to do a first cut calculation, then I believe the Greenhouse Gas Protocol tries to compile this data and give you like a one number type of environment if you want to do just a back of the envelope calculation between different modes of transportation. Again, all these emission factors, you can find them in two varieties. One is a ton mile, and that's, again, aligned with the formula that I presented there, and this assumes certain utilization of vehicles, or you can get it by mile if you're using full car load or full truck load services.
Are there any others who might want to address the sources of data?
Hey, yeah, Jim, this is Jason. I might think that Edgar summed that up really well. I would encourage, if anyone wants the emissions factors, there's going to be the emissions factors that are in the case studies. I also have a list of sources. I'm happy to send it to anyone, and they could simply email me at jmathers@edf.org. And again, jmathers@edf.org, and I will, happy to send that along. And I think the last thing to know on the emissions factors is I think it's what's really important is understanding the magnitude of change. And so I think in this case, we know these factors are not perfect, that they're, but that we, to build on what Edgar says, they're pretty darn good. But it's much more important to see that, what direction emissions are going, kind of what's the scale of reductions that are out there, rather than, to be precise down to the, second or third digit on the exact total of emissions.
Hi, this is Christine.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Christine.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was still on mute. I just wanted to, Jason, you make a really good point. I think the magnitude is important, and I think, from a scientific standpoint, the science side, we want to be as accurate as possible, but the exact number is not what's important. It's the magnitude, and then it's also, setting a metric and then being able to show continuous improvement from a management standpoint. That's what's important, is to understand where are you today, where were you in the past, and then what is your goal for in the future, and how are you going to mark progress, and then have some sense of transparency to be able to share that both internally and externally, and for continuous improvement. That's the important part. So while we want to be as accurate as possible, I actually am not too concerned about what the exact emission factor is. I'm much more concerned with, okay, when we take this data and we normalize it against some unit, whether it's per load, per ton, per dollar of revenue, where do we stand today, and are we better than we were last year?
All right, Christine and Jason, thanks for your contributions there. We received another question, and I think this relates to the comments about mode shift, and it says as follows: is there enough rail capacity? Who out there would like to tackle that question?
All right, so let me try to give a first cut. It's hard to know, to be honest, at this point, if there's enough rail capacity. I think that in the short term, if everyone would like to move everything that is moved by truck into rail, there would not be enough capacity. So definitely that's not the case today for all the movements that happen over the road. But most importantly, the rail network does not cover all the U.S. in the same level of service that you would like to get to be able to do all these mode shifts. So this means that this needs to be opportunistic, To begin with, I think that Ross pointed out a couple of things that are very important. In their case, their facilities and their customer facilities were close to rail yards, and they could coordinate those initiatives, and that's one way to try to use the existing capacity. In the case of Ocean Spray, Christine also mentioned that as part of the, well, I'm not sure if she mentioned it directly, but if not, part of the network redesign exercise that Ocean Spray went through, they actually end up being closer to our rail yard, and this made intermodal feasible for them as well. So if you have current facilities near rail, there will be plenty of capacity. The challenge will be the level of service. And if you are redesigning your network in the short term, I think there will be as well enough capacity. Again, the challenge is always what happens if everyone moves at the same time. But I would like to hear maybe Jason, Ross, or somebody else that have experience on rail as well, what their thoughts are.
Yeah, this is Ross Corthell. In a short answer, I think you did an adequate job of that, Edgar. If everybody moves at once, certainly there is not enough rail capacity for a wholesale shift away from truck. However, there's a lot of things that can be done to increase the current capacity of rail without necessarily laying a lot of track. Our three-tier example is just one of those where, you know, we're getting 8% more out of each rail car. That's fewer rail cars in that network. We actually have a fleet of box cars that we own and manage, and we have a lot of initiatives on backhaul, believe it or not, in rail to have loaded cars going in both directions. And that industry has lagged the trucking industry in terms of thinking about asset utilization in terms of a load in and a load out. But the railroads are really starting to collaborate with each other on the available supply of equipment and lever each other's strengths in lanes to better utilize those assets. So while there isn't enough capacity overnight to wholesale shift away, there's a lot of activity being done to increase the capacity of rail without necessarily having to lay more track or even buy more rail cars. So I think there's a lot of discovery to be had in expanding the capacity through doing things smarter and using technology to do that.
And Jim, this is Jason. I think I'd want to add to this that it's not an either-or thing with rail or trucking, but you know, a both and, right? You know, trucking is critical, it's vital. You know, it is, you know, going to be moving the majority of products in this country for you know, for a long time to come. You know, I think it's much more about how companies are using their resources. So for trucks, you know, when you're moving it, you know, it's getting the most products on there, and then it's also thinking about when you're using it. You know, you're seeing companies like J.B. Hunt partnering with BNSF and you know, putting some of their customers' cargo on trains for long-distance runs across the country. And I think those kinds of partnerships have a lot of potential, and you know, will enable folks to you know, get the benefits of rail, even if it's not, you know, the rail yards aren't necessarily in their backyard. And I think just the last point, you know, I think that you know, as we think about trucks, it's you know, building more efficient trucks over the next, you know, 20, 30 years, and again, you know, just getting the most products on them that we can when we're making the moves.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. And thanks to all of our presenters for taking the time to respond to these questions. Always keeps us on our toes. It's time to wrap up our session, and let me you know, continue by thanking the panelists for their participation in this webinar, but I also want to say thank you to them for participating in the research. We wouldn't be able to conduct the research and answer those unanswered questions were it not for those companies who are willing to put their minds and effort together with ours to come up with solutions to current day and future problems. So we're very grateful for that. Also want to say thank you to Edgar Blanco for his leadership in this particular area, and also make note that as you see on the slide, there's you can get a copy of the case studies and other CTL publications that are related to this if you go to the website that's noted on the slide, but I'll read this out. It's http://ctl.mit.edu/pubs. And filter at that location by author, and the author is Edgar Blanco. And that will bring you up a copious amount of references and resources to consider. Again, thank you to the participants as well for taking the time to invest your time in this session with us. And with that, we'll wrap it up, and we look forward to hopefully having you join us again in the future for our next issue of the CTL webinar series. Thanks. Have a great day.